Today I would like to talk about my research into the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. This is part of a wider research project into the balancing of public interests and rights in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. But for this research, I focused on a particular right, which is freedom of expression, Article 10 of the Convention on Human Rights. Now, the scope of the research is dealing with a particular category of cases, which is cases related to journalists who wanted or who actually published secrets or confidential information and then were restricted in their rights as journalists. For example, they were the subject of criminal prosecution because the information that they wanted to publish or that they actually published was protected under domestic laws, or they were hindered to actually publish the information by, for example, injunctions by courts, or sometimes even their offices were searched and journalistic material was seized. Now, I chose this category of cases to try to analyze how does the court balance the public interest, which is the interest of the state to keep certain information secret, and on the other hand, the interest of the journalists protected by Article 10 of the Convention, which we can also describe as press freedom. So what was the goal of this research? Well, we can say that the goal was twofold, or generally we can say, well, the goal was to find patterns of argumentation, patterns in the jurisprudence of the court in this particular category of cases. But then we can say this was a twofold approach. On the one hand, I wanted to find out, can we maybe find certain general standards according to which the court balances, on the one hand, the state's interest to keep information secret, and on the other hand, journalists' interest to have information published? Are there certain general standards that we can find? So, for example, is there a certain kind of interest such as national security or the interest to conduct criminal investigations as a public interest that, for example, always prevails? Or are there also some other interests which may have a lesser value? So could we indeed establish a certain hierarchy of interests in the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice? Because that could enable us to understand how to evaluate different interests in different cases, and that may even then allow the member states of the Council of Europe, so those member states that have signed the European Convention of Human Rights, to be able to address their domestic legislation in a way to bring it into accordance with its jurisprudence, or also for national courts to adopt a certain structure for their decision making. The second perspective that this research took was a bit wider perspective related to the balancing approach that the European Court of Human Rights takes. So regardless of the specific character of this category of cases, I wanted to have a look at how actually does the court structure its reasoning, what kind of method does it use, because the European Court of Human Rights has often been criticized that the way how it balances rights against interests is a bit of an ad hoc approach, which does not follow a generally accepted structure, but is usually from case to case quite different. So what I also tried to find out is, I have analyzed about 35 cases in this particularly category of cases. I tried to find out, are there certain recurrent arguments that the court always uses or very often uses that we can put into a certain category of arguments, so that we might indeed be able to say these are the different kinds of arguments that the court usually uses, and we may then be able to put this structure of arguments into a new kind of balancing test. So what were the major findings of this research? Well, regarding the first aim that I tried to address, that means what kind of balance can we, or general balance can we find between public interest and press freedom? Can we, for example, say that certain public interests always prevailed, whereas other public interests prevailed sometimes but not always, and still others were never prevailing? So regarding that kind of goal, I must say that the findings were a bit difficult, because the court here did not really address the balance between public interests and then press freedom on the other side directly all the time. In many cases, the court took into account a variety of arguments, particularly also quite factual arguments regarding, for example, how necessary was it here for the state to intervene? Did the state, for example, also have other possibilities to come to the same result result, what were other aspects and circumstances of the state, how deep was the restriction, were, for example, also journalistic sources disclosed or revealed. So all these arguments very often played a role, so that it was quite challenging to actually establish a ranking between different public interests that we can then bring together with the press freedom interest and try to then say, okay, if this public interest is concerned, then that means that press freedom, for example, takes second rank. So such a ranking, a general approach that would, for example, be able to tell the member states, for the pursuit of this interest, you are allowed to do this. Such a general statement, I think, is not possible. So therefore, regarding the first question here, how do we rank publicity interests against secrecy interests, it might indeed be quite difficult to make a general statement. Regarding the second approach here, the second dimension, which was the analysis of the balancing approach and the method that the court uses, we may indeed be a bit more hopeful, because I was able to categorize the arguments that the court uses, frequently and recurrently uses in all these decisions, and put them into certain argumentative categories. So certain arguments such as, for example, was a restriction actually able to achieve the goals that the state pursued? Or was it necessary to achieve these goals? Or have there been other alternative measures available that the court didn't use, that the state didn't use? And then finally, also, what is the balance here between, on the one hand, the benefits for the public interest, and on the other hand, the burdens for the individual right? So as you can see already from these kind of categories of arguments, what I tried to find out was, is it able to put the argumentation of the European Court of Human Rights into the structure of the generally accepted proportionality principle, of the proportionality test, which consists of three main steps: the question whether a measure is able to achieve a goal, whether it is necessary to achieve the goal, and whether it is proportionate in the narrow sense. And my findings in the end regarding this particular issue was that it is indeed possible to put all the arguments that the court uses in either of these categories, and that in the end then means that it is possible, and I also propose that, to change, or you may say to adopt, the proportionality principle also for the reasoning of the European Court of Human Rights.